Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm just so glad you're joining us today because we are looking at something that is genuinely going to change how you view the physical space around you.
Oh, absolutely. It really shifts your entire perspective.
Right. Because, when you pull up a map on your phone or say you look at the property lines for the house or apartment you live in, there's this massive unspoken assumption there.
Yeah, those lines are just, objective facts of nature.
Exactly. Like gravity or the weather. You assume those borders, those land titles, that they all stem from some incredibly rational, modern system of democratic law.
Right, some perfectly engineered geographic system.
Yeah. But our mission today is to uncover the actual root of those property lines, to understand the deepest origins of, global property law and systemic inequality. And to do that, we are exploring a really brilliant historical analysis from June 2026.
It's a fantastic piece of work.
It really is. It's by Mark Wells, and it's titled The History and Impact of Dum Diversas. We're going to unpack how a single, just wildly obscure piece of paper from the 15th century secretly forms the legal foundation of the world you live in right now.
Yeah, the world you are literally standing in today.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because reading through Wells's analysis is genuinely shocking to realize that modern courthouses are silently operating on the logic of, medieval decrees.
Framing this around the concept of invisible architecture is, I think, really the best way to approach Wells' work. I mean, history is rarely just a collection of events confined to the past.
Right. It's not just stuff that happened and then ended.
Exactly. It is the structural framework of our present. The laws, the borders, the legal hierarchies that we navigate every single day, they were built by human beings with very specific, often ruthless agendas and in entirely different eras.
Yeah, eras with completely different moral compasses.
Right. So by examining this 15th century document, we are basically pulling up the floorboards of modern international law to see the wiring underneath.
I love that visual.
Yeah, because we have to think critically about the origins of this architecture if we want to understand how modern legal authority is maintained at all.
Well, let's go ahead and pull up those floorboards. Let's look at the actual foundation stone that Wells highlights here. So the year is 1452.
Yep, 1452.
And the document is a papal bull, which is a formal, legally binding decree issued by the Pope, who at the time served as a sort of almost like a supranational regulatory body for European powers.
Yeah, basically the ultimate legal authority in Europe at the time.
Right. And this specific bull is called Dum Diversas. It's issued by Pope Nicholas V, and he hands it directly to King Afonso V of Portugal.
And the geopolitical context of 1452 reveals exactly why this exchange had to happen. I mean, Portugal was expanding its maritime exploration. They were venturing down the coast of West Africa.
They're pushing boundaries.
Exactly. They were looking for resources, for wealth, and strategic advantages. But to secure those gains, King Afonso needed a legal monopoly.
Otherwise, what? Other empires would just jump in.
Exactly. He needed to prevent other Christian nations from swooping in and claiming those exact same territories. So he needed the highest recognized legal and moral authority in Europe to legitimize his conquests.
And Pope Nicholas V provided that legitimization.
He did. And this was not, just some vague spiritual blessing. It was explicit written permission to conquer non-Christian lands and to establish a legal framework for dominance.
And the language used in the document, that is what makes it so jarring. Wells's analysis highlights the exact phrasing, and it reads like a divine blank check for atrocities.
It really does. It's hard to read even now.
I want to read it so people understand what we're talking about. The Pope commands the Portuguese king, and I'm quoting directly from the text here, to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude.
Yeah. We rarely encounter historical foundational texts that are so blatantly transparent about their intentions.
Just perpetual servitude, right there on the page.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of that phrase. Reduce their persons into perpetual servitude is the critical mechanism. It wasn't simply an authorization to win a military campaign or, extract tribute.
Right. It wasn't just standard warfare.
No, it was a precise legal instruction to permanently alter the status of human beings into property. This document served as the foundational groundwork for West African colonization.
Wow.
And tragically, it laid the direct legal architecture for the transatlantic slave trade.
It is essentially a zoning permit for subjugation. Just imagine the psychological shift for a 15th century monarch. You have these massive political ambitions, but you might still wrestle with the theological or moral implications of entirely subjugating a population.
Sure, even medieval kings had to justify their actions to themselves or their court.
Exactly. But suddenly, the ultimate moral authority of your era hands you a document stating that stealing this land and enslaving its people is not just legally permissible, it is morally sanctioned.
It completely short-circuits any ethical hesitation.
Totally short-circuits it.
And by securing the Pope's signature, King Afonso basically transformed a standard campaign for wealth into a holy mandate.
A righteous endeavor.
Exactly. The decree provided a fully functioning legal and religious green light for forced conversions, territorial theft, and mass human trafficking. It authorized systemic violence on a monumental scale.
Because it framed it as God's will.
Right. It codified the idea that certain human beings lacked inherent rights simply because they didn't belong to the European Christian framework.
Which brings me to a major, just logistical question about how this actually played out. Because Dum Diversas in 1452 was addressed to one specific guy, King Afonso V.
Right. It was a bespoke document for Portugal.
Yeah, focused entirely on Portuguese expansion.
Yeah.
But Wells's analysis emphasizes that this eventually shaped global property law.
It did.
So if I am the King of France, or the monarch of Protestant England a century later, I don't necessarily care what the Pope promised Portugal. So how does a mandate for one nation mutate into a global rule book that rival European powers just voluntarily adopted?
That is such a crucial question, and the mechanism of that expansion is perhaps the most important part of international legal history. Dum Diversas did not operate in a vacuum for very long.
Okay, so what happened?
As European exploration accelerated, this original decree merged with subsequent papal bulls, and together they formed a broader, somewhat secularized legal concept known as the doctrine of discovery.
Ah, the doctrine of discovery. I've heard that term.
Yeah. And rival nations like England, France, and Spain, they eventually adopted the underlying logic of this doctrine, not out of religious obedience to the Pope, obviously.
Right, especially not the Protestant nations.
Exactly. They adopted it out of mutually assured self-interest. They needed a shared framework to carve up the globe and claim new territories without constantly sparking, catastrophic wars with one another back in Europe.
Oh, I see. So it became a sort of gentleman's agreement among empires. Like whoever plants the flag first gets the continent, and the rest of you have to respect it.
Precisely. Under the doctrine of discovery, any European explorer who arrived at a piece of land they deemed undiscovered by Christians gained automatic underlying sovereignty over it.
Just by showing up.
Just by showing up. By merely stepping onto the shore and planting a flag, they legally claimed the radical title of the land for their monarch.
Radical title, meaning the ultimate ownership.
Right. They established a recognized monopoly on trade and settlement that other European nations agreed to honor.
I have to push back on the legal logic of this, though, because the mental gymnastics here are just staggering. The analysis points out that this doctrine systematically stripped indigenous populations of their inherent rights, their heritage, and their land title.
It did, entirely.
But how did international lawyers of the era rationalize this? You have European explorers arriving in the Americas, encountering massive, complex civilizations.
Right, with established trade routes, agriculture, complex governance.
Exactly. They aren't walking onto an empty continent. So how did a shared European agreement legally justify erasing the sovereignty of the millions of people who are actually living there?
Well, the rationalization relied on institutionalizing a deeply racist legal assumption.
Okay.
The doctrine of discovery established a global systemic hierarchy, and this hierarchy asserted that European cultures and governance models were inherently superior.
So they just decided their system was the only real system.
Exactly. Therefore, indigenous systems of land ownership or sovereignty were deemed legally non-existent in the eyes of European international law.
That is wow.
Yeah. The doctrine essentially categorized populated lands as empty or terra nullius, nobody's land, simply because the inhabitants were not Christian Europeans.
Terra nullius, even though there were millions of people right in front of them.
Right. This ideology cemented a global system of institutional racism that allowed colonial powers to legally justify the wholesale extraction of resources and, the displacement of entire civilizations.
Which means the law wasn't just turning a blind eye to the theft. The law was actively engineering the theft.
It was the tool of the theft.
But okay, let's bring this into the modern era, because this is where Mark Wells's analysis really shifted my perspective.
This is the part that usually shocks people.
It's so easy to look at the doctrine of discovery as a relic. Wooden ships, medieval explorers, guys with big hats planting flags.
Right. Ancient history.
Yeah. You would naturally assume that modern democracies have completely overhauled this legal framework. But Wells points out that the legacy of Dum Diversas still silently governs our world today, particularly in nations like the United States and Canada.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals just how incredibly durable legal precedents can be. You simply cannot untangle modern property disputes, indigenous rights, or global inequality without grappling with this initial framework.
It's all still connected.
Very much so. In North America, the legal code currently utilized by modern courts today, right now, to settle historical land disputes and determine indigenous sovereignty still explicitly references the legal framework born from the discovery doctrine.
To really visualize how this works mechanically, think about your computer or your phone.
Okay.
We are running a highly polished, modern operating system. Let's call it Property Law 2026.
I like that.
Right. And the apps you interact with every day, like your mortgage, your apartment lease, or local zoning ordinances, they all look incredibly advanced. But if you open up the terminal and look at the foundational code, the kernel that allows the machine to boot up and function, it is still running a line of code written in 1452.
That is an incredibly accurate way to describe it.
The modern system literally cannot boot up without relying on the logic of that original papal decree.
Yes, because of the legal mechanism of chain of title.
Right. Explain that for us.
Well, when a modern government claims jurisdiction over a piece of land, it has to prove how it acquired that ultimate authority, which, as we mentioned, is called radical title.
Okay.
In the United States and Canada, if you trace a standard property deed back through the century, so you go from a homeowner today back to a developer, back to a federal land, grant the chain ultimately hits a wall.
The original claim.
Exactly. The government's claim to own the land in the first place relies entirely on the precedent that European powers gained the radical title simply by discovering it.
So if a modern court is ruling on an indigenous land claim today, they aren't looking at who was there first.
No.
They're looking at this inherited chain of title that inherently privileges the European claim of discovery over the indigenous reality of prior possession.
The courts are bound by precedent, and the earliest foundational precedents in North American property law rely completely on the idea that discovery gave the European sovereign an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy.
Extinguish the title, that's rough.
Yeah. So when modern judges rule on these cases today, they are often forced to operate within a legal architecture that was specifically designed to erase indigenous sovereignty.
It's baked in.
It is. It highlights a profound vulnerability in our legal systems. Institutions inherit the blind spots of their founders.
Unraveling a bias that is woven into the very first line of the legal code is, it's immensely difficult without collapsing the entire system of property rights.
That's the fear. If you pull out that bottom block, does the whole tower fall?
Which brings us to a massive collision between legal precedent and moral accountability.
Right.
Because if modern secular governments are still trapped running this 15th century code, what happens when the original author of the code decides to patch it?
And that is exactly what is happening now.
Wells' analysis spends a lot of time dissecting how the Vatican is dealing with its own legacy. He specifically details events between 2023 and 2026.
The modern reckoning initiated by the Catholic Church is truly one of the most historically significant shifts in recent memory. For decades, indigenous groups worldwide have been demanding that the Vatican rescind the papal bulls that fueled the doctrine of discovery.
Precisely because those documents are still weaponized in modern courts.
Exactly. They aren't just historical artifacts, they are active legal tools.
So Wells draws a really sharp distinction between two recent events on this front. The Vatican's initial move in March of 2023 and a much more radical step taken in May of 2026.
Yes, the progression there is key.
Because reading through the analysis, the 2023 action feels almost administrative.
Right.
The Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. They essentially issued a statement clarifying that the legal concept does not represent Catholic teaching.
It was a very carefully worded repudiation.
But then Pope Leo XIV issues the 2026 encyclical, and this feels entirely different.
The 2023 repudiation was significant, sure, but as you noted, it was largely a clarification of doctrine. It allowed the church to sort of distance itself from how secular courts interpreted the 15th century decrees.
Like saying, that's how the lawyers used it, not what we meant.
Exactly. However, the May 2026 encyclical, which is titled Magnifica Humanitas, is a document of a completely different magnitude.
How so?
Well, Pope Leo XIV did not just reject an abstract legal concept. He directly targeted the Holy See's own institutional guilt.
Institutional guilt. I mean, that is a heavily loaded phrase for an ancient organization to apply to itself, especially regarding an issue like human trafficking.
It is entirely unprecedented. In Magnifica Humanitas, Pope Leo actively asked for pardon for the Vatican's specific role in legitimizing slavery through decrees like Dum Diversas.
Wow.
He didn't blame rogue explorers. He didn't blame misinterpretations of the text.
He owned it.
He owned it. He directly addressed the reality that the church itself provided the moral and legal cover necessary for the systemic enslavement of millions.
The quote, Wells pulls from the encyclical is just haunting. The Pope refers to the centuries-long failure to condemn this legacy as a wound in Christian memory.
A wound in Christian memory. Yeah.
It implies that the silence itself was an act of violence. This feels like a massive leap from a legal repudiation in 2023 to a profound moral apology in 2026. What does it actually mean for a global institution to formally admit to a catastrophic error that is 500 years old?
This raises an important question about the nature of historical justice. Moving from the administrative repudiation to an acknowledgement of institutional guilt forces a global reflection on accountability.
It really does.
It acknowledges that the ink spilled in 1452 caused generational trauma that continues to compound today, but practically speaking, it also removes the foundational moral pillar supporting the doctrine of discovery.
Right, because if the institution that originally wrote the divine blank check stands up centuries later and says, that check was invalid, it was immoral, and we carry deep institutional guilt for writing it, it totally isolates the modern legal system still relying on it.
They are suddenly standing alone.
Yeah. Secular courts can no longer passively hide behind the historical excuse of a civilizing mission. Not if the architect of that mission has just pleaded guilty to legitimizing human trafficking.
Exactly. It forces those modern courts to admit they are operating on a precedent of raw, unjustified extraction.
It demands a total reassessment of that invisible architecture we discussed earlier.
It absolutely does. If the moral foundation is formally retracted by its creator, the legal systems that built their entire concept of property and sovereignty upon that foundation they are left standing in thin air.
It is a staggering journey we've covered today.
Truly staggering.
From a piece of parchment handed to a Portuguese king in 1452, dictating the subjugation of West Africa and sparking the transatlantic slave trade,
to the mutation of that document into the doctrine of discovery, a global rulebook that systematically erased indigenous sovereignty to feed European empires.
And we explored how that very same legal framework still functions as the underlying operating system for modern property laws in places like the US and Canada today.
Right under our feet.
And finally, we looked at Pope Leo XIV's historic 2026 apology in Magnifica Humanitas, which basically pulls the moral rug out from under 500 years of international law.
It illustrates perfectly how historical events are never truly finalized. They are continuously acting upon our present reality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the most crucial takeaway for you listening right now is to recognize that the lines on your map are not inevitable.
No, they aren't.
The property laws governing your city and the geopolitical borders shaping global power dynamics, they are the direct result of ancient arguments, deeply flawed assumptions, and the strokes of a pen from centuries ago.
And if a single decree from 1452 could silently dictate global property law, institutionalize racism, and shape human rights for over 5 centuries, what invisible assumptions, what biases or legal permissions are being quietly coded into our systems right now, today, that our descendants will have to unravel centuries in the future?
Oof. That is exactly the trolling we need to be asking every time a new policy is drafted or a new legal precedent is set. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the history and impact of Dum Diversas.
It's been a great conversation.
We hope this exploration has given you a powerful new lens through which to examine the structures around you. Keep seeking knowledge, keep questioning the foundation of the world you live in, and remember, the next time you look at a simple property deed, you aren't just looking at modern bureaucracy, you are holding 500 years of history in your hands. Catch you on the next one.